So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. It is a pleasure to have Andrew Bacevich here today speaking with us. Before we begin, just for those of you who are joining who are not familiar with Network 2020, we're a New York-based nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's trying to create more informed conversations around foreign affairs. And if at any point during this talk you have a question, please feel free to put it right in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that we'll ask it during the Q&A time. So with that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our speaker. So we're very pleased to have Andrew Bacevich. He is the president of the Quincy Institute. He grew up in Indiana, graduated from West Point and Princeton, served in the Army, became an academic, and is now a writer. He is the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books, among them The New America Militarism, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, America's War for the Greater Middle East, and most recently, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. He is Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University and has held fellowships at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and the American Academy in Berlin. So with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to you, Andrew, for a few minutes, just to lay the groundwork for us and to tell us what's on your mind vis-a-vis national security and U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me on. What I'll do, shouldn't take more than 3 or 4 minutes, is give a sort of status report, one individual's perspective on what U.S. national security policy consists of today. And I think my basic point to you is that there is none. There is no U.S. national security policy. The Trump administration, in my judgment, is incapable of defining or adhering to a policy based on principles of any sort. So what we have are random impulses, usually accompanied by a presidential bluster, with the correlation between what President Trump says and then what his administration actually does being iffy at best. So between the fall of the Berlin Wall and Trump's election in 2016, basic US policy for that quarter century, there was a policy then. It consisted, I think, of really the one key phrase, and that was American global leadership. Now, if we try to unpack that phrase, what did it signify? What did it mean? I think we come to 3 key points. First of all, it signified a conviction that history is going our way, with US-style liberal democracy destined to triumph everywhere. Now, in a sense, you could say that Americans have believed this since 1776. But I think that that belief came roaring back as a result of the end of the Cold War and the way that the Cold War ended. But the bottom line is that we felt certain in 1989, through the 1990s, into the 21st century, that basically everyone was going to live like we live. Everybody was going to believe what we believe. Second element of this notion of American global leadership consisted of profound confidence in American military supremacy. And I use that word, I choose that word intentionally. Not American military strength, not American military superiority, but American military supremacy. That is to say, that policy elites proceeded on the conviction that the United States possesses the power, the raw power, enabling us to enforce order globally and preventing history from backsliding. that through a reliance on military power, we could ensure that history was going to its predestined end, which was everybody's going to embrace our values and our way of life. And I think the third thing is to say about American global leadership is that it resulted in some Americans doing very, very well. In the post-Cold War era, some Americans certainly enjoyed life, liberty, and happiness. Alas, as became apparent particularly in the 21st century, this American global leadership left behind a very large number of our citizens who became alienated from the project. And I think that if to summarize the three post-Cold War administrations of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, what they did, or at least allowed to happen, was to demolish these three expectations. That the notion that history is going our way was demolished. The expectations of American military supremacy demolished. The expectation that somehow this approach was going to enable Americans to enjoy life, liberty, and happiness was demolished. And indeed, this then really describes Trump's inheritance as it was. Now, for Trump himself, the purpose of being president is simply to be president. It's to build himself up rather than to accomplish anything that of substance. That said, the people that Trump has hired to implement basic policy in the Trump era, people like Tillerson and Madison, McMaster and Bolton and Pompeo, all of them, in my estimation, cling to that post-Cold War paradigm. That is to say, they still believe that American global leadership can be made to work. They are either unable or unwilling to accept the fact that it has failed and has become irrelevant. The truth is, history is not going our way. History goes its own way. It's not directed by any one people, any one nation, any one individual. American military power turns out to be actually quite limited, and perhaps worse still, can be easily misused as it has been. And the actually if you look at actually existing circumstances in our country in the present moment, we can see that the paradigm of American global leadership does indeed work for some. It makes some people very rich, but it leaves all kinds of other people behind, and those people get pretty darn angry. Where's the evidence of all this? I think the evidence is everywhere. Pointless and mismanaged wars, a succession of economic crises, vast economic inequality, a bungled response to the coronavirus pandemic, and of course, periodic reminders, sharp, painful reminders of the persistence of American racism, most recently in the reaction to the George Floyd killing. The problem, as I see it, apart from the fact that Trump is an unprincipled individual, is that the people around him, members of the policy elite, are still stuck in a past that really is no longer relevant. To me, that defines our problem. With that, I'll stop, and I look forward to any questions that any of you may have.
All right, thank you very much. I'll just kick it off with a few questions. You've given quite a good overview, and called to mind, I think, my favorite part of War and Peace at the very end, when Tolstoy goes into the idea of where history comes from and how history is written. But at any rate, I wanted to follow up, because you brought up a lot of very interesting points. So with that in mind, how would you suggest bringing about a smarter national security and foreign policy in the U.S.?
Well, we need to give up on this notion of American exceptionalism. We need to give up on the belief that somehow history or providence or God or something has summoned us to save humanity. Easy for me to say,
Right.
hard to do, because I think that American exceptionalism over time has come to be really hardwired into our collective consciousness. Certainly was reinforced by the end of the Cold War, which seemed to validate the claim that we know where history is supposed to go. It's unfortunate, I think, that we don't have a major political party that pushes back against the claims of American exceptionalism. What we have instead, I think, are two parties that, in different ways, buy into it, compete with one another in offering, their vision, their plan for how we are going to do history's bidding. This is a big problem. I don't have any solution to that problem. But I guess the beginning of wisdom would be for Americans to recognize that American exceptionalism is indeed a problem. Now, on a more sort of practical vein, we need to confront our military failures. If we look at the George W. Bush administration's response to 9/11, declaring a so-called global war on terrorism, embarking upon a war against the so-called axis of evil, invading Afghanistan and then Iraq with expectations that we could transform those two countries, make them like us in some form, and that decisive victories in Afghanistan and Iraq would then lead to successive successes that would have the effect of transforming the greater Middle East. None of this has played out. We don't know how much money we spent on our post 9/11 wars, but best estimates are something in the order of $6 trillion. We've lost thousands of our own soldiers. We have tens of thousands wounded, whether physically wounded, psychologically wounded. We have killed hundreds of thousands of people. Seems to me that there is a desperate need for an accounting, a moral accounting, a political accounting. What should we conclude from those military failures? I don't think anybody in Washington, very few people in Washington, have an appetite to take on that accounting, but it's very much needed. I think another thing that we need to do is to recognize that if there ever was such a thing as a unipolar order, meaning that we were the sole superpower, if that ever existed, it doesn't exist today. We live in a multipolar world, meaning that if we're going to have any semblance of peace, and my own definition of peace is fairly limited, just not big wars, then there's going to be a need for the various elements comprising this multipolar order to figure out some way to live with one another. We don't have to love one another. We don't have to like one another, but we have to live with one another. We have to live with China. China has to live with us. And you can go on and name a number of other important actors. But if you cling to the notion, that we are somehow the supreme actor on the global stage, then it becomes very difficult simply to recognize the enormous difficulties that will be inherent in trying to create a multipolar order. So again, so much of this relates to the mindset of our political elites, which I think have become completely detached from reality. In the present moment, one more point. I think in the present moment, meaning this combination of a pandemic that has killed over 100,000 of our fellow citizens, now colliding with this latest reminder of how deep racism is in our being. I think what we get a hint of here is that we can no longer afford to subordinate domestic politics to international politics, which we did from World War II through the Cold War and after. That sort of, the domestic problems, economics, social relationships, those things could sort of be managed because we were busy, defending the free world. I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. So there has to be a lifting up of domestic problems to receive more attention than foreign affairs. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. Actually, you actually anticipated one of my questions. I was going to ask about that link between, or the connection between domestic policy and foreign policy, because I think you're not the only person who's made that argument. And Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations comes to mind with, foreign policy begins at home, and I think in this moment, we absolutely need to address that. And the headlines these days are sort of inescapable. So I just, before we turn to the Q&A box, because some questions are coming in, I just wanted to just push a little on some of your points to get a sense of, what a different U.S. foreign policy might look like. And that's in part because, and I hear your point about this illusion of U.S. global leadership. Yet at the same time, especially over the course of the past couple of months when I've been having conversations like these, one refrain that comes up often is that U.S. leadership is needed, whether it's in global negotiations on climate change, or whether it's in regional disputes in Southeast Europe, for example. Just the idea that having the U.S. presence or knowing that the U.S. is paying attention helps. How would you thread that needle in terms of trying to help where help is needed or wanted, with the same time not getting overly involved?
Well, you have to begin by being realistic about what we can do, and I think also we have tended to equate global leadership with possessing and using military power. Could be that we need a new model. Perhaps global leadership should begin with the United States serving as an exemplar. Take climate change. We're among the worst offenders. What if we cleaned up our act and then took our example to the rest of the world and said, hey, look, you can do this too. Look, we have reduced, the argument would go, we have reduced our carbon emissions, and yet we can still have a prosperous society. Well, if we can do it, you can too. In other words, don't just preach, but practice. I think that would be one way. I mean, because when I criticize American global leadership, I'm really criticizing sort of a phrase. It's a sort of that stands for, to be blunt about it, global dominance. It stands for hegemony. So you say, well, can't we still lead? And the answer is yes, we can lead, but we have to redefine what it means to lead. And I think move our understanding of leadership away from an emphasis on military power, on coercion, more toward an emphasis on doing the right thing because it's the right thing, and therefore demonstrating to others that we can save the planet, but we're not going to save the planet by invading countries and overthrowing regimes.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. I personally have more questions, but we also have actually a very full Q&A box. So I will turn over to the Q&A box and kick us off there. Thank you very much for that intro. And before I do, just a reminder to everyone, if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the Q&A box. You can raise your hand if you would like to ask it live. Or if you are participating by phone, you can email it to Brian at bthang@network2020.org. So with that, our first question is, can you imagine any time in history when the U.S. foreign policy is more out of sync and so inconsistent with its own values than it is right now? And if so, what should be our immediate priorities on that front?
Well, I don't want to make historical comparisons that ignore detail and differences. But U.S. foreign policy during the period between the two wars, between the world wars, was deeply problematic. We have forgotten that the United States in the 20s and into the 30s was an imperial power. You know, people think, oh, that was when we did isolationism. No, we had U.S. forces in China. The Philippines were a colony. What is it? Like 7,000 miles from San Francisco to Manila. So there was a U.S. garrison in the Philippines, U.S. troops in Panama because that was a possession, U.S. troops in Hawaii, U.S. troops in Cuba, U.S. troops in Puerto Rico. So we were an imperial power, but we didn't think through. Policymakers didn't think through at the time the cost benefit of maintaining that empire and the commitments that would be necessary if indeed we wanted to maintain it. So in essence, we had an empire that we didn't bother to defend. How do we know that? Well, we know that because if you look at the first 6 months of World War II, Japanese seized most of that empire or damaged it. So this goes back to a basic principle of statecraft, which is that means and ends have to be in some kind of relative balance. And again, this is one of the things that went wrong in the post-Cold War period. Our ends were vast. Everybody was going to be like us. We were the sole superpower. We're going to be that way forever. And the means were inadequate. Now, we constantly told ourselves that we had the best military on the planet. In many respects, that's probably true. But it turns out it was not a military that was adequate to the appetite of policymakers in Washington, which became crystal clear after 9/11. So it's always good to think in this terms of what are we trying to get done? What are our objectives? What are our goals? What are the resources we have available to try to achieve that? Maintain some rough balance. We didn't do that in the 20s. We didn't do that after the Cold War.
And I think you bring up a very important term that's actually in the name of the Quincy Institute, and that statecraft as well. And I think that maybe is something that goes missing sometimes.
Yeah, because you know, in practice, particularly after the Cold War, statecraft became military policy. It's one of the problems with the phrase national security policy, which of course I use, we all use. You know, national security policy ends up being synonymous with military policy. And to your point, statecraft, diplomacy, they tend to become afterthoughts.
Well, and just as a side note too, as I served very briefly in the Foreign Service, but I always follow with interest those who argue that the professionalization or the politicization of diplomacy, you know, particularly when it comes to ambassador level positions, is something that, you know, not any other country really does quite the same way that we do, and I think it erodes the ability of our diplomats. But
well, you know, before the Foreign Service was created by a piece of legislation in the early 1920s. I want to say 1923. So prior to that time, American diplomats were all amateurs, as it were. We hadn't professionalized our diplomacy, but we had some pretty fine diplomats. John Quincy Adams would be a very good example. His son, Charles Francis Adams, who was minister in Great Britain during the Civil War. Another example. So we had some pretty top-notch people out there representing the country, even if they weren't professionals. So after World War I, we committed ourselves to professionalizing American diplomacy, partly by creating the Foreign Service. Some incredibly talented people have served in the Foreign Service, and we could, tick off names like George Kennan and Charles Bolin and so on. But to your point, yes, we have undervalued that professional asset, and therefore used diplomatic appointments simply as political prizes to be handed out. Now, if we were some third-rate country, you could probably get away with that. But we are a great power with global responsibilities, and it really is kind of a travesty to hand out diplomatic appointments like they're pieces of candy to say thank you, for giving X number of dollars to my campaign. Gotta end. It really has to end.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So on to the next question. I hijacked the Q&A queue. I apologize. So our next question is, why is there an overemphasis in the U.S. security strategy on conventional military assets, such as naval ships, stealth bombers, tanks, etc., and minimal or low-level interest on non-conventional military assets like a cyber army of hackers, a radiation biohazard medical response team, investment in civic virtue, and research into techniques to better attack non-state actors and terrorists who threaten the USA? What is preventing such a realignment in policy?
So we have an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, and a Marine Corps. They all have traditions. They all have a history. And they have leaders who are devoted, who are the stewards, who are expected to maintain that history and those traditions. And I think that results in an absence of free thinkers not welcome. If you want to be a naval officer and you want to make an argument that really, aircraft carriers are kind of left over from another age, maybe better ways to secure our interests on the high seas, you ain't going to get very far up the totem pole. So that's one answer. The other answer is that from the point of view of the services, they have had better luck, better success when they focused on conventional war. Those are the wars they want to fight because those are the wars they think they can win. And when they win, then the prestige of the services increases. When they don't win, they're embarrassed. If you look at the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq as two illustrations of this, particularly Iraq, let's just focus on Iraq. The Pentagon wanted to fight a conventional war because the Pentagon felt certain that it could win a conventional war. And in a sense, that wasn't wrong. We got to Baghdad in no time whatsoever. The Iraqi army disintegrated. Saddam Hussein went into hiding and was eventually pulled out of a hole and executed. The American people applauded. We had, victory parades, mission accomplished. The problem was that the war actually hadn't ended. Instead, it morphed into something unexpected and unexpectedly complicated. We found ourselves opposing an insurgency. We found ourselves in the middle of a civil war. We found ourselves stymied in our expectations of being able to create an Iraqi government and Iraqi security forces that could sort of take over. And so we ended up in this debacle that went on year after year after year, and even today has not resulted in a stable Iraq. Who wants to fight those kind of wars? Not the Army, not the Marine Corps. So it's certainly possible technology that war is changing radically, dramatically. But the services, there's people who devote their lives to being Army officers, Navy officers, and so on. It's they're very reluctant to abandon those traditions, to abandon the way they do things. And although we have this principle of civilian control, it says that, you know, the civilians give the orders and the soldiers sort of supposed to, civil military relations is far more complicated than that sort of image implies. And therefore it's far more difficult for outside critics, the civilian leadership, to bring about substantive change.
Well, that actually segues nicely into our next question, which came in even before you started talking, but it was pre-registration. But the question is why don't we hear more people in the U.S. Armed Services speaking about the misuse of American military power? I understand why those on active duty are reticent, but there must be many retired officers who share your views. And then this questioner would also like to hear more about the activities at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft.
Well, first of all, there are some retired officers who are critics of U.S. military policy. They're in a minority. Why doesn't the majority participate in a serious discussion of our failures? I don't think I know. If we look at senior officers, it's because many of them are they are the architects of failure, and it's hard to acknowledge responsibility for something that goes badly wrong, as is the case with our post 9/11 wars. And also, they're true believers. You know, if you spent 30 years in the Air Force, you know, this is a service that is devoted to the proposition that I'll use a gender term: manned aircraft, fighter bombers, strategic bombers. That these are instruments that can and ought to play a decisive role in armed conflict. They've devoted their lives to that proposition. And so when somebody says, well, maybe we don't need pilots, maybe we don't need to be dropping bombs, maybe there are other ways that we can influence or coerce, we're asking these people to give up, you know, what is become something on the order of their religion. You know, oh, you don't need to believe in Jesus anymore. You know, we can have this other set of beliefs. I think that's about the best answer I can give.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds almost like some of the identity issues that ripple across other professions that are being remade by technology in a way as well. You know, that there's an identity issue there.
But these are identity issues that aren't necessarily related to technology. You know, in our politics, you know, it seems to identity politics. Mm-hmm. You know, the politics of gender. You know, the politics of sexual orientation. To my mind, tend to yield fixed beliefs. These are the things we stand for. These are the things we believe. And within those communities of belief, I don't think there's a lot of openness to asking first order questions. Mm-hmm. And I think that applies to the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we all need a little bit more openness in our lives. Let's see. So our next question is, you said that U.S. foreign policy is non-existent under Trump. Did we have a coherent policy earlier? I'm thinking of Libya, Obama, Iraq, Bush, Serbia, Clinton, and more, going back at least to Vietnam, LBJ, and Nixon. Also, to what extent is the risk of a nuclear crisis and therefore nuclear war forcing us to...
Well, the burden of my presentation was to say yes, we did have a foreign policy. It was called, in my mind, using military power. And those sort of episodes that you cited were examples of that. Whether we're talking about Bosnia, we're talking about Somalia, or whether we're talking about Vietnam. So there was a consistent theme. It wasn't good. I mean, I guess you could say it was successful in the sense that ultimately we prevailed in the Cold War. But when you toed up the costs along the way, it's an odd form of success. So nuclear weapons is an interesting question, mostly because we ignore them. One of the things that just surprises me so much is that during the Obama administration, we embarked upon a massive program of modernizing our nuclear weapons. New warheads, new submarines, new missiles, new bombers. I forget now the total sum that this project is supposed to cost. I think it's $1 trillion. It's going to take until the 2030s before all these new systems are in place. It's an astonishing investment that gets virtually no press whatsoever. So we are committed to, I don't think I would say we're committed to maintain nuclear superiority. I'm not sure the term means anything, but certainly we are committed to maintaining vast nuclear strike capacity indefinitely, despite the fact that the non-proliferation treaty that we signed, back in 1967, 68, commits us to disarmament, to promoting disarmament. We have no interest in disarmament. But it'll be interesting, we're heading to another presidential election. I assume there's going to be debates between Trump and Biden. I would be willing to bet that the question of this nuclear modernization project never gets asked, even though it should be asked.
Interesting. Well, yeah, time will tell, but I think it's a very good question to ask about. And personally, we really enjoy the work of Rachel Bronson at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and they do a lot with on the nuclear side. So if anyone wants to check out their work, that's a good place to look. So our next question is, isn't President Trump in tune with global leadership trends with similar populist leaders emerging in places like India, Philippines, Mexico, Brazil, Hungary, Italy, Spain, etc.?
Well, there's clearly a populist trend. I don't know if that's the right label, but let's use that label, nationalism. I sort of push back against the notion that somehow these trends are connected, and in particular that they're connected to Trump. That because Trump did this, then what's his name in Brazil, Bolsonaro. That's why he does what he does. Because I don't buy that. I mean, my personal view is that domestic politics are a function of domestic forces. I think the notion that somehow what's happening in Hungary or in Brazil or India is because of Trump it's sort of a reverse form of American exceptionalism. It assumes that people out there do things because of what we do. And I think that's deeply misleading. They do things out there for their own darn reasons. Now, they may claim some justification with one another. It's very interesting to sort of keep track of the interaction, if you want to call it that, between Trump and Boris Johnson, where Boris Johnson wants to think that he's Winston Churchill, which of course would require Trump to be Franklin Roosevelt. And as soon as you try to get your head around that, you realize that the whole thing is a bunch of nonsense. So I just wouldn't assign such a large role to the United States and these trends that are happening in other parts of the world.
Just to push on that a little bit, would you say then, I mean, could they be connected in some way, or does it have to do with that idea of American global leadership? I mean, is there any connective thread that you see? It doesn't need to be about the U.S. necessarily, but some trends that are happening.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue, perhaps with merit, that to some degree, the nationalist surge stems from the failures of globalization. Globalization said that if we open up the world to trade, investment, that everybody would benefit. Didn't work out that way. Some benefited, some didn't. And we certainly were in the forefront, as our nation was in the forefront of those promoting globalization as the way of the future. So there might be some kind of a connection there.
So our next question is an interesting one. It's the person who submits it says, I accept your view of no longer believing in American exceptionalism. How would you have recommended responding to the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon as well, if they were to occur today? Or if that is too far-fetched, how do you recommend the U.S. go about protecting itself from non-state actors?
Well, first of all, we have to take care not to exaggerate the dimensions of the threat. Mm-hmm. Why did 9/11 happen? Well, I mean, many ways to answer that question, but I mean, in sort of the immediate, what happened on 9/11? It's because we didn't defend ourselves. You know, we didn't bother to put in place even minimal security requirements related to commercial air travel. We allowed ourselves to be naked to this conspiracy by 19 foreigners. So the answer there is, the answer there is in some senses what we've been doing since. Trade our commercial air system and do bad things. So that's one answer. But to what would I have done? Who knows? But I mean, what would I at least recommend in retrospect? Gauge the threat. Terrorism. This is Al-Qaeda specifically is an international criminal conspiracy posing a modest threat, not an existential threat, but a real threat to all nation states. No nation state, to my knowledge, is keen on having terrorist organizations running rampant all over the place. A common interest is that nation states will control the instruments of violence. So what we might have said is, holy cow, this is a threat to all of us. And it's not a threat to be addressed by invading countries and overthrowing regimes. It's a threat to be addressed by putting together an international posse, international cooperation, police cooperation against international terrorism. And we might have said, as the country that has been victimized in this terrible fashion, we want to play a leading role in organizing this posse that would have then attacked international terrorism. Would the result have been victory in the sense that terrorism would have been eliminated? No. Could we have substantially reduced terrorism by taking this collaborative approach? I think the question is unquestionably Yes.
Mhm.
So war against terrorism, as George W. Bush framed it, was a huge strategic mistake.
Mhm. So just to follow up on that a little bit, in terms of cooperation, I mean, one could argue that in Afghanistan we did rally, in international coalition, but you're saying direct that energy in a different way, not
Well, we
necessarily
put
going and invading a country,
together a
but
coalition
taking
to invade the country and overthrow the Taliban.
Mhm.
Now, I don't want to be an apologist for the Taliban. I don't believe the Taliban, let's not confusing it with Al Qaeda. I don't believe the Taliban represented a very significant threat to the well-being of the United States of America in 2001. But we embarked upon a war.
Mhm.
We ousted the Taliban. And here we are, almost 20 years later, still involved in that war.
Yeah, that is a big question. So our next question is, my question is, how can American leadership focus more on improving its domestic policies rather than focusing on being the world's watchdog?
Well, it's a great question, but I think it requires a major sort of, at least one of the parties is going to have to, I guess, make a basic decision. Instead of privileging this notion of American global leadership, spending $1 trillion a year or so on our national security establishment, that party is going to have to say, well, all of that is now going to have to take a back seat to domestic issues that are more urgent. And it's not difficult to identify those domestic issues. I mean, again, at this particular moment, I'm a privileged white guy, but it's difficult to comprehend the persistence of racism in our country. Maybe it's difficult to comprehend for me because I'm a privileged white guy.
Right.
It's difficult to comprehend the incompetence of our government at all levels that results in 100,000 dead from this pandemic. Especially when we have examples of nations ostensibly not as advanced as ours that did a much better job. So all of that testifies to misplaced priorities. But you have to have one of the, we have a two-party system, I'm one of the ones who would say, I wish we had a new party, but we're stuck with the parties we got. Real change would require one of those two parties embracing a fundamental difference in priorities. I don't think that's likely to happen.
It's hard. It takes, I think, a whole culture shift.
Yep.
In the political parties, and then in the United States too. I think some of some of the myths that we grew up on, I think, are maybe a bit anachronistic for our time.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So here, I want to get through as many of these as possible because we're getting down to, we got about 10 minutes left. So our next question is, the participant wants to know, every administration promises to defend national security. Does the current crisis call for rethinking what the real threats actually are? And then I'll just piggyback on that with the question that I had, which is, what are some of those legacy commitments that you would do away with, and if you were to then realign with what the priorities actually should be?
Well, the two legacy commitments, two in particular, I would get rid of is number one, our commitment to defend Europe. NATO was created in 1949. At a time when the western part of Europe was devastated from World War II, was vulnerable, economically weak, needed our help. So in 1949, NATO made a lot of sense. The Soviet threat was fairly substantial, at least we thought it was. So here we are in 2020. Western Europe is prosperous, pretty firmly democratic. You know, you can point to Hungary, you can point to Poland, but I mean, pretty firmly democratic. If you look at the major countries, Germany, France, it's time for them to take responsibility for their own security, in my view. They are capable of doing that. They won't do it as long as we say that we'll foot the bill, but they're capable of doing that. I think we also need to realize that the failure of our Middle East project, that we thought, this is the premise of the Carter Doctrine, going back to 1979, that somehow mustering American military power, we can bring order to the Middle East. They're just the result. It was just the opposite as resulted. So I think we need to end our military commitment to the greater Middle East. Doesn't mean that we turn our back on the greater Middle East. It's just that we realize that this is not a military project, it's a diplomatic project. And the crucial diplomatic challenge is to persuade, at this point, persuade Saudi Arabia and Iran to coexist. Ain't easy, not trying to suggest that it is, but when you think about the wasted lives and money from our military misadventures, maybe it's time to let diplomacy have a chance. So I do think that there are pre-existing commitments that can be done away with. But then there's the reorientation toward new priorities. And the obvious one is climate change. Where by and large, we're twiddling our thumbs. You know, even setting aside Trump's irresponsibility on this matter, let us not kid ourselves that under President Bush or President Obama, that we were the world leader in addressing the problem of climate change. We were slowly moving the ball down the field, conferences, agreements, but the urgency of the problem was far greater than the urgency of our response. And that is becoming central to the whole question of our national security. So we need to do a better job there.
Well, and I think it ties into economic security as well. If we're not spending the time and energy to become leaders in, just looking at renewables, for example, right, and what we produce and what we can do there, we're missing the ball on that. Yeah. So, all right, next question. So, do the foreign policy mistakes made in the post-World War II era arrive from a misunderstanding of the origins of the Cold War? Rather than being a battle to contain communism, it was actually a response to Soviet efforts to prevent U.S. hegemony, expansion, domination, and control of the world order. I think that the questioner is basically asking if our Cold War battle was if we were responding to a different fight than the one that we actually should have been fighting.
Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. I will not agree with the proposition that the Soviet Union was some benign enterprise, that they did what they did in Poland or in Hungary or in East Germany, mm-hmm, simply because they feared American global hegemony. They had their own ambitions. It's really complicated. If we look at the Cold War through the lens of ideology, as opposed to if we look at the Cold War through the lens of geopolitics, we end up with different answers. Okay, so I'm sorry to do this. I'm going to walk away from the camera for 1 minute and let my 30 seconds and let my dog out of the room.
Completely fine. Completely fine.
Okay, I'm back.
Thank you. Those dogs can be persistent, so
Right.
you know.
Mhm.
All right. So I'd like to try to get through a couple more questions. I know we're coming up on time, but we have some good ones here. So the next one that I want to ask is about human rights. So the questioner poses, why has the US chosen not to take a stand against blatant human rights abuses perpetrated by governments against citizens, even though ignoring human rights can lead to significant destabilization and national security concerns? In other words, why aren't ethics or values a driving force behind our foreign policy decisions?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say we ignore human rights issues. I think it's probably more accurate to say that we attend to foreign rights, human rights issues when they coincide with perceived geopolitical interests. But I guess the questioner wants to know why this is, why we have been selective, I guess.
I think so.
And then I said, well, we should be. But what would that translate into in terms of policy? We could condemn violations of human rights. Not sure that does much good, but we could at least sort of make a principled moral stand. We could sanction those who abuse human rights. We do in some cases, right? I mean, the Iranian regime violates human rights, and we're imposing all kinds of sanctions on the Iranian regime. I'm not sure that the record of economic sanctions translating into better behavior on the part of human rights violators. I'm not sure there's much of a correlation there. Or we could use force. You know, we could identify human rights violators as, you know, people that needed to be punished through coercion. Punishment could be limited. You know, you could bomb them. Punishment could be more decisive. We're going to go in, we're going to overthrow the regime in Tehran. Of course, we've tried that. It turns out that when we stick our noses into these situations, we find that we really don't understand them. No, get it. I mean, maybe I obsess too much about Iraq. I think there's all kinds of reasons why we invaded Iraq in 2003. But I think George Bush himself was sincere, genuinely sincere, in believing that by eliminating this awful dictatorial, brutal regime, that we could pave the way for liberalism and democracy in Iraq. Didn't turn out that way. So I think that there's a huge conundrum about how to translate concern about human rights into policy. And I guess the answer is it's case by case by case by case. I don't know that there is a sort of a one size fits all prescription, nor do I think that the questioner was implying that there should be a one size fits all.
And often I do think certain things happen behind closed doors that we're not always privy to in the public. But let's, okay, so I think we'll, if you may, maybe we'll just try for one more,
Sure.
and then wrap up. So the last question we'll get to. Thank you for your bold insights. We are now also in the middle of a world economic crisis. How can we forge new constructive relations with Europe, China, and other Asian countries?
Well, that's certainly a tough one. You know, let's pair that question with the previous question. it's not impossible to imagine that the Chinese government is going to intervene in Hong Kong in a major way and destroy democracy in Hong Kong and, oppress any number of people. And they will say that they're doing this because Hong Kong is part of China and that, therefore they have the authority to maintain order there. On the other hand, if the United States would have that event, the one I just speculated might occur, as a break point in US-China relations, major impact on trade, on investment, on educational exchanges. Well, you go down that path and you're looking at another Cold War. So I wish I had a good answer, but I don't think I do. I think what we confront are the complexities of statecraft, where there may be black and white issues, but there aren't black and white answers.
There aren't easy answers. That is completely true. Well, we've gone over time. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today and for being, so thoughtful about your insights and about your take on the world. I think it's a fascinating one. And again, for those of you who are listening, Andrew runs the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which it's a newer think tank, and they're doing, I think, a lot of interesting work. So it's worth checking out. To those of you still on the call, we have another call coming up on Thursday with Thomas Graham at 2 p.m., I believe. Yes, at 2 p.m. on Putin and the pandemic, what's to come in Russia. And then next Monday, we're speaking with the Consul General of the UK in New York on the US-UK trade relationship. And just as a reminder to everyone, we're trying to continue to offer these virtual briefings to everyone, free of charge, all over the world. I think we're almost in 50 countries and counting, and just an appeal to generosity out there. We won't be able to do this for free forever. And so if you feel in your heart that you're able to make a donation, we would appreciate it. And because we do feel that, being able to get questions from all over the world is an important one. So with that, Andrew, thank you. I hope we'll see some of your participants on Thursday, and take care. Really appreciate the conference.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.